Speakers here today, Robin Wilson and Elizabeth Meehan. Robin is co-leader of the Northern Ireland team in a devolution project which is coordinated by University College Dublin and is also completing a PhD on the trials of power sharing here. Elizabeth was former and founding director of the Institute of Governance, where we're based today, and now Professor Emerita, is that pronounced properly? Well, hopefully, in the School of Law in Queen's. Robin is going to give the main presentation, which will last about 25-30 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion. Seminar will officially end at 1 o'clock, but we'll have a light lunch served outside, so hopefully you'll be able to stop and have lunch with us and perhaps continue the discussion out there as well. So I'll just hand over to Robin. Thank you.
Thanks, Paula, and thanks to Life and Times, or to ARK rather, for asking me to do this. Yes, there will be references to the Belfast Agreement in this. I should say that even though I'm going to talk for 20-25 minutes about a range of things you see in front of you there, which are addressed in the update that some of you have already diligently read, in which case I'm afraid I'm going to bore you by covering a lot of the same ground. Even just this module of the Life and Times survey on political attitudes and the role of government is very big, and I'm not going to touch in what I say on large chunks of it, and it may well be when it comes to questions that there'll be issues which there's no reference to that either Elizabeth or I will be able to answer on in terms of other questions we haven't time to cover. For example, lots of questions that were asked in the role of government module asked people whether they thought the devolved government should spend more money on X. So on health, yes, absolutely. On education, definitely. On the police, that too. And then when they were asked, should government increase taxation? They say, oh no, never do that. Not even on the wealthy. There isn't even a majority in Northern Ireland for more taxation of the wealthy. Never mind the worse off. But that's something we can come back to if we want. I wanted to focus on some of these issues that are quite raw, actually. And I was a bit taken aback by some of the data whenever we first saw them. And you'll see in a moment why I'm suggesting that some of the data indicate that we've got some way to go yet to become what you might call a normal society in Northern Ireland. And those are the issues I'm going to touch upon. In the A Shared Future framework, which government published in 2005, I have an interest, I helped draft some of it. The aim was identified as a normal civic society in which all individuals are considered as equals, where differences are resolved through dialogue in the public sphere, and where all people are treated impartially. The political scientists among you will recognise that's taken straight from David Hell's theory of cosmopolitanism, and it was. But it was an ill omen that this policy was shelved when devolution was re-established in May last year. And so what I want to do today really is to ask, do the questions on the role of government and political attitudes suggest that that normal civic society is or isn't emerging? If it was to be emerging, what we'd expect to find would be a commitment to universal norms of democracy, human rights, the rule of law, which are widely respected across post-war Western Europe. We would expect to move away from nationalistic politics, and we always get confused with this in Ireland because actually unionism is a form of nationalism in the same way as nationalism is a form of nationalism. I'm using that in the all-embracing sense. Nationalism in wider Europe is usually not as something that should accrue parity of esteem to either version, but actually should be treated with considerable distance. We expect to move away from that kind of politics, which obviously led to the Second World War, and which now predominates elsewhere in Europe only in spots, albeit important spots, like Flanders, the Basque Country, Cyprus, Bosnia and Kosovo. We'd expect also, if we're moving towards normality, a focus on the devolved assembly as a key political institution, rather than the governments in London and Dublin, as was evident through the peace process. And we'd also expect people to be more interested in day-to-day issues rather than constitutional ones. Okay, so how then are things going in those regards? One of the difficulties that we have with the Belfast Agreement is that, as one of its negotiators said, it was an agreement to disagree. And one of the ways that that was arrived at was by avoiding a discussion about the past and who did anything that they should or shouldn't have done in the past, or who didn't do anything that they should or shouldn't have done in the past. And this normative ambivalence has left, I'm afraid, a legacy, and this is one of the elements of the legacy. When asked, do you have sympathy with the reasons for violence from loyalist or Republican groups? That was a separate question, loyalist, then Republican. Even if you don't condone the violence itself, as you see from the table, that 29% express some sympathy vis-à-vis loyalist violence, and 30% with regard to its Republican counterpart. Now, of course, it's true that only a small minorities express a lot of sympathy, and there is that qualifying clause about not condoning violence. But at this distance in time from the Belfast Agreement, given that violence is so stigmatised in Europe, that's still quite a large number. And this actually brings it into perspective as well. This is the figure of 1998 when this question was last asked. The first year of the Life and Time Survey and the last time it's actually been asked. As you can see from the table there, there was actually a lot less sympathy for the reasons given for violence by loyalist and Republican groups in 1998 than there is today. Roughly half, in fact, as much as there is today. That correlates with the fact when you break this down by age, you'll find that among young people there is a significantly greater level of perceived, greater level of sympathy for the reasons particularly Republican groups give for violence than among older people. Particularly noticeable is that 11% of Catholics expressed a lot of sympathy. If I could just go back. No, I can't go back. I haven't actually got the. Sorry, I haven't got the relevant slide up there. But when you break it down by religion as well, it's 11% of Catholics expressed a lot of sympathy when it comes to Republican violence. And that does raise, I think, a big question as to whether the constructive ambiguity which officially characterised the peace process has, in the pursuit of short-term realpolitik, engendered long-term problems for the legitimacy of democratic arrangements, which don't just depend on people not supporting violence, they also depend, sorry, there are the figures there for Catholics only, I did actually put that in, and you'll see 31% express a lot of sympathy for Republican groups. Similarly important is the belief in the rule of law and belief in human rights, as well as a belief in the rule of law, rather than sympathy for violence. By universal standards, again, the most extreme denial of human rights during the Troubles was manifested by internment, introduced in 1971, and for those with long memories, followed by an upsurge of violence before it was phased out in the mid-1970s. Now, this obviously is back on the political agenda, and very topically I arranged today that the debate would take place in Westminster on 42-day detention, just to add some a frisson to this talk. Given old Gordon Brown's troubles, I was quite surprised he was so biddable in that regard. The 42-day period is roughly 10 times the period which was ruled by the European Court of Human Rights in a 1988 case involving Northern Ireland to be too long in terms of compliance with the European Convention on Human Rights. Article 5 of the Convention, and I'm baffled as to why this isn't more at the forefront of the debate in Britain at the moment. Article 5 of the Convention says that if someone is detained by the police, then they must be brought, and the word is promptly, before a court And in this 1988 case, which was taken under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, bizarrely, when this was introduced in 1974 by Roy Jenkins, he said it was draconian to bring in 7-day detention. And 3 people took a case to Strasbourg. At that stage, of course, they couldn't go through the British courts to vindicate their rights under the European Convention. And they were detained for various lengths of time. The shortest one was detained for 4-day detention, and the court ruled that that was too long to comply with Article 5. So obviously the Equality and Human Rights Commission is saying we'll take a review, we'll pursue this if 42 days goes through tonight, and I find it impossible to imagine that this will pass muster with the European Court of Human Rights. But coming back to Northern Ireland, well, of course there's a connection, as you'll see here, between Protestant attitudes to detention and how the DUP will vote tonight. But coming back to Northern Ireland, you can see that the Life and Times survey found that 58% thought that it was perfectly okay for the authorities to detain people for as long as they want without putting them on trial. Now, it doesn't even say terrorist suspects. It doesn't even say 42 days. It says detain people for as long as they want. It doesn't say the authorities are, actually. That if you thought that was extraordinary, among Protestants, the figure is 66%, while among Catholics it's only 40%. As you'd expect, there's quite a significant difference on that. And I'll just show you the results for Protestants only, as you'll see. 2/3 say that definitely or probably this should be something the authorities should be able to do. Even on a more modest question as to whether protest marches, and of course marches in Northern Ireland convey various things, including the early civil rights marches, should be allowed, attracts quite significant dissensus, even though it's a absolutely fundamental right in a democratic society. As you see from that, 1/3 of people in Northern Ireland think that protest marches and demonstrations should definitely or probably not be allowed. And again, there's no suggestion that this is marches leading to violence, that it's either illegal march or demonstrations, just any kind of protest demonstration. So you can see on those two bellwether issues on human rights, there's clearly some way to go. Now, to put these results in some kind of context, you could say, well, most people didn't express views which confer legitimacy on still less personally condoned violence, and I would stress that that remains the case. It's also the case that most people didn't definitely believe that the authorities should be able to detain people indefinitely. And on other civil liberties issues in the survey, mostly there was majority support for them. But it is useful to put this against the backdrop of a piece of research that Vanni Barua did recently with an Australian colleague called Mangan, which compiled what they called a bigotry index on the basis of, I think, 3 different questions about race, religion, and something else. Maybe anti-Semitism. Sorry? Sexuality. Was it sexuality? Oh, that's right, it was. Sexual orientation included. And it found that by comparison with 18 other democratic countries, let's call Northern Ireland a country for a moment, we had the most bigoted, that we were highest on the bigotry index. And I think the conclusion you have to draw from this is that, as I said earlier, that this idea that was prevalent at the time of the agreement, where we won't mention the war, essentially. That not mentioning the war is now proving to have a long-term legacy that could eventually come home to roost. Now, the next thing I wanted to turn to was the point I made about nationalism. And this is something that will seem very foreign to a lot of people here, but actually it wouldn't seem very foreign in European context. A commitment to universal norms goes with a commitment to the public good, and in particular the idea of non-discrimination between fellow citizens. Nationalism speaks the collectivist and conformist language of community, by contrast, around the individualist and democratic discourse of the citizen and so advances the cause of one imagined community over another. And there's a very useful book done recently about nationalism by a Turkish guy who, I must confess, it looks a bit like his name is Karimli, but I've known Turkish, and I'm sure that's a terrible bowdlerization of his name. But he provides what I think is quite persuasive argument that you can't really make a distinction between nice civic nationalism and nasty ethnic nationalism. In any event, elections in the last decade have shown a big swing in Northern Ireland, as we know, to the Democratic Unionist Party and Sinn Féin. And the survey found that these parties enjoy a support of about 1/3 of respondents, whereas in the year of the Belfast Agreement, their combined endorsement was only 16%. Now, this is well below their electoral performance, and that's partly because you've got the none of the above down here. And it's also likely, and there's some evidence from Nicholas White's analysis, that, as Yeats would have put it, that the centre ground lacks all conviction, whereas the nationalists on either side are full of passionate intensity and tend to turn out in larger numbers. The official view in London and Dublin is, of course, it doesn't matter because the Sinn Féin and Democrat Unionist Party are the new moderates. And so everything really is fine, even though they didn't predict this was going to happen. And it's therefore, I think, quite arresting that a recent study of what he calls populist radical right parties in Europe by Kaz Muda, and these parties are defined as parties which are A, nativist, that's nationalist plus xenophobic, B, authoritarian, and C, populist. Muda kind of brackets the DUP in the populist radical right group, and of course adds, for good measure, they're also religious fundamentalist. And he puts Sinn Féin just outside on the grounds that yes, they're authoritarian, yes, they're populist, yes, they're nationalist, but they're not actually xenophobic, except towards Protestants and English people. So let's compare how we are with the European standard in that regard. In terms of actual electoral performance, in the Assembly election in 2007, the DUP got 30% and Sinn Féin got 26%. And you can see from those figures that the greatest success any other populist radical right party has achieved at any time in a general election is the so-called Freedom Party, or rather, as you all know, those of you know, they might have rather misnamed party called the Freedom Party of Austria, which got 27% in 1999. Followed by the other, also bizarrely named Liberal Democrat Party of Russia, which got 22.9% in 1993. So last year's Assembly election result was historic in a sense, which perhaps Tony Blair didn't mean at the time. It was the biggest vote ever for the radical populist right in Europe. And it's of course worth saying that when these parties achieve what they achieved, that when the Austrian party achieved its greatest its successes and was subsequently invited into government by the Christian Democrats, the rest of the European Union introduced sanctions against Austria because they saw this as a threat to democracy. The Flemish Interest Party, the Vlaams Belang, has to keep changing its names, keeps getting banned by the courts. The Flemish Interest Party is another very high performer, and in fact it gets better than 16.8 because that's its overall vote in Belgium. If you took Flanders, it's actually a higher percentage. And of course it's treated as a pariah party by all the other parties in government, never allowed into power sharing in Belgium. And that's not even opposed by the Christian Democrats on the Belgian side. Now, that's all the bad news I'm going to give you. I'm not going to give you the good news, which is substantial, thankfully. And the first bit of good news is that even if the governments haven't managed to sort out the Northern Ireland problem, but have simply rolled it under the carpet, brushed it under the carpet, Rogers Brubaker makes a persuasive argument that over time, in most people's ordinary lives, they tend to say, as Martin Turner did in a wonderful cartoon about loyalist paramilitarism, where he's got a tattooist who's tattooing the arm of this loyalist paramilitary guy, and he's got UDA, UVF, RH set all the way down his kind of arm. And there's a little spot at the wrist that's empty, and the tattooist is kind of saying to the loyalist guy, says, listen, son, like most of us, you'll soon tire of this loyalist politics. So the idea is that eventually kind of quotidian concerns tend to take over as people's lives move on. And I think Brewbacker's argument is something to say for it. And you'll note that when people are asked whether they think of themselves as a unionist, a nationalist, or a neither, now in fact the neither is the biggest group at 40%. And in fact, if you go down the age range, you'll find that amongst young people it's about 50%. And that's a significant change since 1998 in a positive direction. In the 1998 survey, unionist was still the top affiliation, and neithers were on 1/3. Now they've taken over as the top affiliation and displaced unionism. I just say in passing that, of course, you never hear from anybody in the Northern Ireland media that there ever is a group that's of this nature whatsoever. Another positive aspect in this regard is a degree of tolerance for possible constitutional change. This has been asked in previous Life and Time surveys, and it's got a similar result this time. And that is, as you can see, that when people are asked how they would feel in the event of a vote for United Ireland, only 12% say they wouldn't be able to live with that. And most are happy to say they would either support it, or if they didn't support it, they would be willing to defer to the wishes of the majority. And the other way around also applies, as you can see there. Also on the positive side of the balance, and this again reflects what's been said in previous Life and Time survey responses, people are asked, do you think that the Assembly should focus more on policy issues or constitutional issues? As you can see there, something like 2/3 say the focus should be on policy issues, and only about 1 in 8 say it should be on constitutional issues. You may or may not see that as reflected in the priorities of Northern Ireland politicians. Again, when people are asked of the constitutional issues, which do you think is the most important, it's not the ones that would be the conventional unionist stroke nationalist agenda. Only 35% say the focus should be on that, and 53% say devolution of policing and justice. And again, similarly, and again this in line with previous results, when people are asked, and it's also in line with results in Scotland and Wales actually, when people are asked which institution I think has the most influence over the way Northern Ireland is run, and obviously the question is asked similarly the way Scotland is run, the way Wales is run, most people tend to say, well, not most, but the largest group tend to say it's the government at Westminster that's the most influence. But when they're asked which one do you think should have the most influence, you can see that the answer, as with the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh National Assembly, is the Northern Ireland Assembly, where 2/3 think that should have the most influence. Just some points then in conclusion. It is a kind of mixed picture. There are these positive trends towards democratic normality, the stress on bread and butter issues, on the Assembly, tolerance on the constitutional issue. But there is, I think, in this quite a strong evidence of an authoritarian hangover from what was called the Troubles. The sympathy for reasons for violence among paramilitary groups, weak support for civil liberties, and of course the polarisation towards these authoritarian and populist parties. And as a result of this, when you take these two things together, we've tended to have deadlocks on a range of day-to-day issues along sectarian lines, most obviously, of course, the 11+, but a whole range of other issues. We've had London brought back into the equation rather than the arguments being sorted out, for example, over devolution of policing and justice in the Assembly. there's been very little legislation actually passed in the Assembly other than, ironically, to maintain parity with the rest of, with England. Of course, the devolution of policing and justice has been indefinitely postponed. So I think in the balance, you would have to say that the negative trends are perhaps for the moment still outweighing the positive trends, and so we've still got some way to go before we get to a real normal civic society in which all citizens are treated as equals, in which they resolve their problems through dialogue, and in which a government treats all their claims in an impartial fashion. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much, Robin, for that. Hopefully that'll be quite a lot of food for thought there. So we're just going to open up the floor now for some questions or comments. We have about 20 minutes before we'll stop them for lunch. As Robin said, there are a lot of questions within the two modules of role of government and political attitudes. The fieldwork for the survey finished less than 6 months ago, so obviously this is just very much the start of doing the analysis of this. So there are a lot of questions that maybe you want to ask, but you may find that we haven't actually done the analysis on them yet, but hopefully that will be coming in the next few months. So because we are recording this on video, we'd like to ask you to use the mic if you have a question. So hopefully Dirk has volunteered to hand round the mic. And if you're going to ask a question, if possible, could you give your name and an organisation if you have one, just so that we know who's asking the questions.
Can we have Elizabeth here as well, Paula?
Yeah.
Because also mean that she can share this mic with me.
So any questions? Yes, here we have one. Yeah.
Hello, Alan Leonard, Northern Ireland Foundation. Yeah, I was intrigued to hear, Pauline, about the international, that this is part of the international survey effort, and I'm very curious to learn some international comparisons to, because as ever, normal is relative. Particularly, say, Robin, when you're looking at the whole internment question, I'm always mindful of the current law in France that has quite a long period of detention without trial, does it not?
It's a different system.
But would a similar question have been asked across several countries? I'd be curious to learn kind of popular attitudes, even if it's only within, say, the United Kingdom and the Republic, and then to look at that over time.
Yeah, I'm just going to lean in here so that my voice gets picked up. Yeah, there was a battery of questions asked within role of government, so that will have been asked in more than 40 countries worldwide, and those questions that you're talking about, it's about protests. Some of them are put in the context of if a government wanted to bring out laws that people wanted to demonstrate their disagreement with, which of these things they should be allowed or not allowed to do. Others are set in different contexts, but those questions were asked or have been asked in more than 40 countries worldwide. When the data is available is a different question. But there is a website, there's a link from our website to the International Social Survey Programme website and to their archive. Everybody who takes part in that programme will archive their data. So you will be able to get the data for all the participant countries, but as you can imagine, that's a big job, so it could be a few years down the line before you're able to see that. Okay. Anybody else? Dirk, got any questions? Yeah, thank you.
I'm not sure if there's a... Sorry, Lee Modad from Queen's University. I'm not sure if this is a question or a series of small comments. I was really struck by the point made at the outset about 42 days and the arguments around that. I mean, it's really a serious reminder about how far things have moved along in terms of what people are willing to accept, internationally even, and raises the question about, when you talk about normality, a moving norm. And what is normal? And what is normal, it's very hard to talk about the norm as fixed in the world we're living in, right? So you then went on to depress me more and more, and I was almost suicidal until you started
halfway through.
halfway through.
You improved.
You started talking about some good news, which I felt better then. But it seems a couple of small things. First of all, on this question of nationalism, right, which you keep throwing out, I mean, one could say that every state has its nationalism, right? We live in a world of national states, okay? And that, indeed, a certain degree of it is necessary, right, to allow people to subscribe to the kinds of universal norms that you're talking about. And that when people really are willing to buy into those norms, they're really talking about willing to extend them to their compatriots. And this whole thing about the priority of compatriots, right, which is captured within existing states, right? They mightn't be so willing to extend them to people outside of that, to foreigners, or indeed to recently arrived migrants or what have you, right? But there is this sense of people being willing to buy into these norms, provided that, and extend them to people that are quite like them and that subscribe, that they think at least, subscribe to, we'll say, the belief that they're all French or they're all German or they're all Irish or what have you. Now, we've got a problem with that, obviously, in Northern Ireland, in a sense of disagreement about the state. And I suppose that I thought, well, okay, the civic sphere that you're talking about, is it actually realistic at all to imagine that this kind of normal civic sphere could be constructed within Northern Ireland as an entity itself, right? As opposed to within the UK or some kind of all-Ireland context or a UK Republic of Ireland, you know, a broader context. Is it realistic, right? And if one says, well, it's not realistic in the short run, and if you look at the sociological sort of nature of this society, how divided it is on the ground, right? How it has gone through the last 30 years of violence, right? Then one would take a much more optimistic kind of read of the kind of data you presented. Given the lack of agreement about who your compatriots are and so on, all that, given that the kind of divisions and so on. And all right, we, you know, taken out of context, we look bad in terms of, you know, voting for populist parties and so on. But a lot of, you know, is there an argument that, you know, one should be in fact more optimistic, even than you were in the second part of the paper? I'll leave it at that. Sorry for going on and on. Various things.
Sorry, Dex, just go.
No, all of that I kind of sympathise with. On the first point about what is normal, I mentioned the post-war European context, and in a sense the establishment of the Council of Europe, the creation of the European Convention on Human Rights and the European Court of Human Rights were really meant to say we have to define a normality which is universal and can't shift, and which doesn't allow for the kind of things that happened in the preceding years in Europe and the inhumanity that led to. And I was very struck when I was at a conference on terrorism in Spain in 2005 on the anniversary of the Atocha station bombings, organised by the Club of Madrid of former heads of state and government, big international conference. Nobody there I could see from the UK, nobody there I could see from America, but a very strong consensus emerged at that conference, particularly reflected by people like Zapatero there, obviously from the government of Spain, other European figures, which was not only is it not an issue of trying to find a balance between security and human rights when dealing with terrorism, but actually unless you preserve human rights and the rule of law in dealing with terrorism, you've already been defeated. I just think there's a complete lack of understanding of that in Britain, and it's a huge problem. Nobody asks themselves, well, why is it that Spain's no longer a target when they were a huge target a few years ago? Well, the answer is because they, through the normal process of law, they dealt with the people who perpetrated a criminal act. What Britain and the US have done is instead elevated these people to politically legitimate almost, and then say we'll have a war against them. Well, you can't have a war against a non-phenomenon, terrorism. You wars against states or groups, but not against terrorism. And so it's been a failure, and so Britain now faces this huge alleged threat. Well, frankly, the answer is to do what Spain has done. Pull the troops out of Iraq and have a normal way of dealing with terrorism. On the thing about nationalism, I'm impressed by the argument that Ulrich Beck makes for what he calls constitutional tolerance, and he argues that, and in this sense, Northern Ireland, you could say, isn't just normal, but is actually ahead of the norm. He argues that in most societies now, life is increasingly multinational. So, for instance, in his own Germany, obviously, large Turkish community. And what he says we need to think of now is a kind of modern version of the Treaty of Westphalia, in the sense, if at that stage the idea was the state must be neutral between religions in order to allow freedom of conscience, his argument is the state must now be neutral between people with different national affiliations so they can live together and coexist. And you could say that there's an element of that in the Belfast Agreement, in that phrase about people being Irish or British or both. I'm an Irish citizen. The people who obviously are British citizens, those who are Irish citizens. I mean, getting on together fine. If I was to say I wasn't just an Irish citizen but a nationalist, I would immediately cause problems for the British citizens here and vice versa, and that's where the problem is. We make the leap from an ethnic community to a kind of political position which is counterposed to the other. I think that is actually doable. Just finally, sorry, Liz, very quickly.
I thought you'd finished. Yeah.
The point about taking Northern Ireland out of context, in one sense, Liam, I think we really need to put Northern Ireland back into context. And I think one of the huge problems about the Mitchell Conference was the idea, almost like kind of Lenin, we were going to export the revolution across the world, and I just find that really embarrassing, frankly. Sorry, Elizabeth.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I thought you'd finished. I just wanted to tell Liam about one or two other findings in the survey, which perhaps would support his perhaps, albeit cautious, greater optimism. And I think the findings do show contradictory things and some quite quirky things. There's another question about whether people should be allowed to not only march but hold a national strike, and it's rather striking that I think about 50% of people who identified themselves as DUP supporters said national strikes should not be allowed, and 44% of Sinn Féin people, or people who identified themselves as Sinn Féin members, agreed with that there probably or definitely should be detention without trial. So it's oddities. But leaving aside those quirks, I think there were other questions about, so one question about which would be worse in a justice system, to convict an innocent person or to let a guilty person go free. And really most people, and there wasn't much difference between different categories except a small group who identified themselves as people of Ulster. And really everybody thought it was worse to convict an innocent person than to let a guilty person go free. And there's another question about whether in the event of of a suspected terrorist attack, whether telephone tapping should be allowed. And really on the whole, more people, although there were differences in terms of class and party and all this here, but in total, more people thought it was probably or definitely not right for the government to have the right to do sort of blanket telephone tappings. So I think I accept your point about shifting norms, because it maybe maybe you can't expect people to sort of immediately forget about violence in the past, but it may be that that gradually people are sort of becoming more normal in some respects. Well, there was another one. What?
Maybe we should let the people of Ulster secede.
Yes. There was another one about stop and search, and in that case we were back on the Conservative side, because more people thought the government should have the right to stop and search than should not have the right in the event of a suspected terrorist attack.
Okay. Anybody else got any comments or questions? Okay.
Right, Chris Morris, DSD. I was just wondering whether it would be productive to add to the questions that you were asking the phrase "people like you" and see whether the result was different. So, is it all right for the government to detain people like you?
Right, yes, oh, I see, yes, very good idea, yes, yes.
Yeah, that might make a big difference to the responses. Anyone else? Yeah, there's a question up in front. Sorry, here, and then.
Hi, Lucy Cochran, CAB. I was just curious, really, in general, about the change in voting patterns. Was any of the questions in the survey around changing your allegiances to maybe a more populist party, or did anyone give any views on that?
Shall I answer that? We didn't ask a question about changing allegiances in that. I should highlight that the way those questions were asked about political party support changed between 1998 and 2007, without going into the intricacies of it. In 1998, the results that are shown here for political party support was actually a variable that we derived based on 3 different questions, where we tried to ask people, do you have support? If you didn't support a particular party, who would you vote for, whatever. Whereas we asked a much more clean, cut down version in 2007. I can't remember the wording straight off, but again, you'll find it on the website. I don't think that would account for the change, obviously, but I just wanted to highlight that the question has been asked quite. There has been a change in the question, but we haven't asked about changing allegiances or anything over time.
One thing I could say, so was it Lucy? Yeah, is that if you look at the 2 questions with that caveat that Paul has just entered, interestingly, the SDLP support holds up reasonably well, and the implication is that Sinn Féin support's mostly from emerging new cohorts of voters, and I think that figures, though most recent polling evidence would actually suggest that Sinn Féin's support is in not quite meltdown, but certainly in severe problems. But it's on the other side where it's clear there's been a huge shift from the Ulster Unionists to the DUP for reasons that are pretty well adverted to by now.
If you're
sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, if you're interested in people's attitudes to voting, whatever, there have been election surveys over the years, and again, they're available on the ARK website, that will go into that more detail about how people voted and the decisions that they take, to come to the way they voted, whatever. So that may answer some of your questions.
So I was just going to say that I recently interviewed a very senior former British government official who said he could not believe how unionist leaders, including Trimble and Molyneux, were so willing to buy 3-legged horses from such notorious horse traders as British prime ministers. He said that Tony Blair was something of an existentialist in that he lived in the moment, and in that moment he sincerely believed what he said. That explains some of the shift from the West Unionist Party to the DUP.
Okay, I think, was there a question? Okay.
Thanks, Chuck Richardson, the Spirit of Enniskillen. I was interested in the figures for young people. That 50% of young people saw themselves as neither nationalist or unionist, which is an astonishing sort of level, I thought. But also contrasting that with the fact that there's an increase in young people feeling the rationale for the uses of political violence, and the thing. And also maybe putting that onto the last Young Life and Time survey, which also said that there's a significant rise in optimism of young people towards community relations in the place. And I wonder, did you have a view? They seem to, be strange contradictions. Anyway.
Yeah, that struck me as well, Chuck. I think it's partly it's different young people. The greater support among young people for paramilitary violence is really pretty much greater support among Catholic young people for republicanism. I think that does raise a huge issue about the way that the armed struggle's been legitimised in a certain way, and now there's no victims. It's kind of kosher to be a lot more supportive of it than it was when perhaps the human costs were a bit more obvious to those of us who were living through it. But I think that it's quite likely that the people, mainly in disadvantaged working class Catholic communities, who might be thinking that way, would not tend to be the ones who are likely to be in more middle class kind of positions, who are more find it easier, if you like, to think in more cosmopolitan terms, partly because their social situation facilitates it. That's my best explanation. It struck me as well.
Okay, we have time for one last question. Yeah, Lisanne at the back there.
Lisanne Dodds, ARK. It occurred to me whenever you were going through the first couple of slides and looking at the increase in tacit support for violence among young people, that actually there's a generational effect in there as well. In the 20 to 24-year-olds in 1990, in 2007 would have been 10 and 14-year-olds in 1998, and possibly learning about things in school and history, and that could go some way to explaining those discrepancies.
Yeah, I think the corollary of that, Lisanne, is that nobody has confronted the challenge, apart from Gordon Gillespie, God love him, but nobody in government's confronted the challenge of the need to have a history book about the troubles that can go in every school in Northern Ireland. It's something that's got to happen. It doesn't mean there's got to be treated like some kind of Bible we've all got to agree with, but it's got to be a point where kids can be told the same story and not have this endless situation where the prod kids are doing the Blitz and the Catholic kids are doing the famine, and nobody's talking about the troubles. Because it also puts parents in the possible position where they don't know what to say to their kids about it all, and it's not responsibility they can, you know yourself, your parent, not responsibility they can reasonably be asked to discharge.
Okay, well, it's 1 o'clock, so I think we'll finish here. And